WeardnessTheShow.com.
Feel needed. They do a good job of, making guys feel needed here and making guys feel a part of, the future and things like that. So I think that gives guys more comfortability, knowing that they're needed. And, you're hearing it from Gersh's voice alone. He's saying how much he wants you here and needs you here. So, I think that gives guys confidence and, it instills confidence in us too.
D-Lo recapping the season with the Judd Zulgad hood pulled up look.
Up. I love
Judd
that.
will go with oftentimes.
I think absolutely an awesome call. Hold on. In fact, you know what? In honor.
There you go.
Of
You're
D-Lo,
the OG. You're the OG of the hood up look. All these NBA players are just copying your style.
Well, they saw me years ago, and they're like, I really admire that old guy with the graying beard. What can I do to be more like him?
Welcome into the show. This is Mackey and Judd here, and we've got a special guest right off the top, our fun friend Dane Moore, our fun basketball-loving friend from the Dane Moore NBA podcast, which is I love to see the success you've had in the podcast space and see that people have found your basketball wisdom, and we're going to tap into that here to recap the Wolves season. I think the Western Conference is lucky because they just ran out of runway there. They just ran out of runway with the hot finish to the season, Dane.
Did they? Did they, Phil?
Listen, I never told you how long the runway was, but they just ran out of runway.
I was thinking about this last night, because people, D'Lo said in his quote after what Declan played, he was like, playoffs are a possibility next year, and everyone kind of starts getting ruffled up about that. They're like, oh, we got this expensive roster. Like, it's time to go. Like, they better make the playoffs next year. And I'm sitting here having just read an article about the 7-8 game between the Warriors and the Lakers. And I'm like, who are the Wolves going to replace in the playoffs next year? Like, I think they will be better next year. I think they will be, something close to what we've seen for these past 20 games. But it's like, all right, if it's not the Warriors or the Lakers coming out next year, who is it? Are the Blazers going to fall out there, the 6th seed? The Mavs, the 5 seed, I don't know. It's gonna be hard for this team. I'll put it like this: it'll be a huge accomplishment if they do make the playoffs next season, and I think it's also kind of an expectation.
So, Dane, what from the success that Phil talked about late in the season that Phil enjoyed and said, win games because you certainly had the large faction of saying, "What are you doing?" As a person that watches this team every day and has a really good feeling for where things have gone in what was certainly a weird season, what is your assessment of what the late season success meant as far as the most important thing, which is, can you then ride that, and is that a real tangible thing that's going to translate to 2021-22?
It's black and white, or it's not black and white. There's some gray area there. To some extent, a lot of it is inflated. I'm sure we'll talk about at some point how good Anthony Edwards' numbers were over this stretch. D'Angelo Russell put up good numbers down the stretch, but the Wolves are also playing games that are 140 to 120 down the stretch. So, you're going to have numerous guys scoring 20 a game. I think it was inflated, but at the same time, we saw real tangible improvement and things that I think will translate to next season, specifically with Anthony Edwards. I was actually thinking about Phil before he got in the show. I was like, all right, what's the batting average of a baseball player? If they're hitting 40 home runs, what batting average are you cool with? Where you're like, this guy's efficient. What would you say that is?
I would say it's more on base percentage to get really granular with your side street here, but you got to be getting on base at a 300 clip, or everything else is going to be tough.
So that was the whole thing with Anthony Edwards, right? Even at the beginning of the year, he's scoring 20 points a game, and to get granular on the basketball side, right? If you're not making half of your twos and a third of your threes there, you're not even close to approaching a league average shooting efficiency. And what we've seen from Anthony Edwards over we kind of cut it the past 22 games of the season when D'Angelo Russell came back, is you're seeing a guy who averaged over 23 points per game and well above league average shooting efficiency in terms of his 3-point, his 2-point percentage, his true shooting percentage overall. So we're not we're at a point with Anthony Edwards where we're not talking about like upside anymore. We're not talking about an inefficient chucker guy who might end up getting there. Like, we saw 22 games of Edwards where he, statistically speaking, was playing at a level kind of like a Donovan Mitchell numbers wise, kind of like 90% of what Luka's numbers were. Like, it sounds hyperbolic, and people would want to dismiss it like, oh, but the Wolves have like the third worst record in the league. Well, over that 22 game stretch, the Wolves went 11-11, 11-9 in games that Cat played. So, like, if there's one thing to believe in from the end of the season, and I can give you a lot of things to not believe in, but if there's one thing to believe in, like, Anthony Edwards just is that. And I think you guys know me well enough to be like, I'm not the guy who comes here and like pumps up the tires of stuff and like, what's the thing to come on to? Like, Anthony Edwards, I've really shifted my tune on him over these past 2 months.
But isn't that so? And I agree, there's a laundry list of things to assess here. But like, if the reason I've been so bullish the last month on, forget about the lottery thing, just I know that it would be great to also add a top 3 pick to this roster. Don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying it's either or, but if this nucleus doesn't gel and look like a winning team, then like you can add another player to it, but eventually you're going to have to go through another rebuild anyway. So I was more interested personally in the development of this nucleus and Anthony Edwards than I was in them losing 10 straight games just to secure a 40% chance to keep their pick. And of all the things you could nitpick, I feel like Anthony Edwards is the most important. And if you have seen a transformation throughout his rookie season, and we certainly have, I think that's super important. And I'll even add this: you bring up like Donovan Mitchell, and I think it was you that tweeted the Luka comparisons on some of the stats and the rates yesterday. If he is all of a sudden going to be the version that we've seen for the last 20 or 25 games, if he's going to be that guy for 82 games next year, this is a playoff team to me. And I don't know who they replace. I can't answer that question yet. But like that guy for 82 games and Chris Finch with an offseason, to me, like, that's a different ballgame than what we saw this year.
I mean, I'm with you, but the problem still is the defense. Like, Anthony Edwards, I think I wouldn't say he made strides, plural, defensively over the course of the season, but I would say he made a stride defensively. And I think Cal had his best defensive season of his career. And we saw D'Angelo Russell try on defense sometimes. Still, when all those things were happening together, under Chris Finch, the Wolves were 29th out of 30 teams in the league in defensive rating. And I mean, it's still a massive problem. It is the problem that Gerson Rosas has to try and, rectify this offseason, that Chris Finch has to try and scheme for this offseason, because at the end of the day, Anthony Edwards can be Donovan Mitchell, whatever, partially Luka Doncic offensively, but if he's one of the worst defenders in the league, as he was for much of the season, it's not going to translate to winning. And we're going to be talking about, like, all right, maybe 500 basketball, and 500 basketball won't get you into the playoffs in the West. So that's when we start talking about what I'm skeptical about, or what I do think will translate over to next season. Like, I don't know if I can say that I think the defense is going to be significantly better next year. And without that, like, I don't know how much changes. What
potential changes that Gerson can make then, Dane, would get them towards that step of bolstering that part of their game?
It's tough, man. They don't have cap space. Like, they don't, and they have a 78% chance or 72% chance of not having their pick. So you're running up against it where, like, you got to trade Rubio or Beasley, probably attach an asset onto one of them and try and get a power forward. I mean, I'm at the point, I think Chris Finch is at the point too, where he thinks Jaden McDaniels is a 3, and that would be his preference for using him in that way. Obviously, you have Cat as one of the bigs, but they need a 4. They need a power forward who can defend the rim, who can rebound the ball at a high clip, and who can play pick and roll defense. The Wolves are terrible at all 3 of those things. Cat's terrible at like 1.5 of those things. So you got to address that. It's the same as, I mean, I'm sure I came on here like 6 months ago and we were saying the same stuff, but that's the position on this roster. Jaden McDaniels filled in some of it, but Chris Finch was talking about it the other day, and he referred to him as 170 pounds. 170 pounds. Like the kid's like 6'9". I mean, he's skinny. He fights, but he's not a power forward.
Yeah. So Dane, give us. You are so in tune with X's and O's and just some of the granular things that I think will help you enlighten our audience here. And we love Ryan Saunders on this show. He's been a friend of the show. I think he's a wonderful human, but obviously something changed and clicked when it took him a few games, but when Chris Finch comes in and the team starts winning more, I think getting players back was helpful. But what are some of the biggest things that Chris Finch has done that you have seen, whether it's tangible X's and O's things or whether it's more just like the way that he is communicating and empowering certain players?
I think the defensive scheme changed drastically. What you saw under Ryan Saunders, and this was in conjunction with Gerson Rosas, was what they would call an analytically driven defense, where you're trying to force teams into taking the least efficient shots as frequently as possible. We call that a drop scheme, where it's a high pick and roll, and you drop the big man back to the rim, and you're kind of inviting 16-footers. It's maddening at times because people, I'm sure they've been watching these games this year, they're like, get up, cat. Like Devin Booker or Bradley Beal's made like 7 straight mid-range pull-ups. But, that's kind of the quote-unquote analytically driven defense. You just try and force those shots the whole time. And what I think was extremely frustrating under Ryan Saunders was not that wasn't smart. It was just so dogmatic. And as a basketball player, like, it doesn't take you long in the midst of a game to get a feel for like, all right, this is the areas on the floor that they're giving me. And if I'm Bradley Beal and I have confidence in knocking down a 15-footer, I'm going to take those. But 2, I just know that this is my area to work from. I'm going to get into the nail and I'm going to look to distribute to the corners or out for the pop or whatever. And it was just such a conservative scheme that I always viewed it as having a real high or a real low like glass ceiling of like maybe mediocrity even if it worked out perfectly. What we've seen from Chris Finch is a complete shift towards aggression defensively. They refer to it as this scramble defense, where they're helping and recovering. We call them X outs, where so-and-so's coming out on one guy and the other guy crosses over, making an X to close out onto that guy. And it's why when you're watching these games, we're seeing this scrambling sort of defense. A lot of times we see Anthony Edwards get steals out of those sort of situations, and it looks like exciting and energetic and, sometimes leads to fast breaks. But the reality of the situation is the Timberwolves were 21st in defense under Ryan Saunders last year. And under Chris Finch, we just went through it. They were 29th in defense now. So I personally believe that this current scramble system is just like a hack that looks good. And I think Chris Finch has kind of talked about that too. He's like, yo, we don't have the guys or the time to really put in a structured system. So the way I kind of like compare it to is it's like back in the day when you were a kid and you were just clearly had the more athletic team. You're like, hey, we're just going to full court press whole game, just whole game. We're going to full court press. And like this team's like fatter and slower than we are. So we're probably going to get some steals. Like that's what Chris Finch has put into place. And it looks good when it looks good, but ultimately neither of the systems have worked. And that's why I think you just need new defensive personnel largely. And you just got to you got to nail it schematically for where you're going.
So Dane, how different does this team look potentially? And I'm not saying that this will solve things completely, but with a full camp under Finch, and his ability to deploy his personnel in schemes that he actually wants and is not sort of forced into because of the timing he got hired. How different could things be, and how different do you think philosophies might be with him now having a lot of time then to gear up for a season?
I don't know, Judd. I mean, honestly, I don't. Like, it's hard. It's hard to know, and we always kind of do this thing where we're like, all right, they got time now. Like, they got the offseason. They got the core together. They got their stuff. Like, it's going to be better. I believe in Chris Finch as like a basketball thinker. I think he will put a good plan into place. I don't know if it's going to work. I don't know if it's going to work. I think it'll probably work offensively. I think they'll be a top 10 offense next year for sure. I think they're already, pretty much approaching on that at the end of this year, and that was without Beasley. So it's just going to be about defense, and defense isn't just about scheme. It's about getting the guys to buy in to do it, to whatever that scheme is. And I think the thing I'm interested to see with Chris Finch is what does this look like when things start not going well? What do things start looking like in 20 games in the next season, and it's clearly Cat and Ant's team? What does that look like from a D'Angelo Russell perspective? Mm-hmm. What does it look like when Malik Beasley has clearly fallen to 4th or 5th in the pecking order? What do the personalities look like there? That's the ultimate challenge of NBA coaching, is you have all these dudes who have been top guys on their basketball teams all their life. They've been bucking. Malik Beasley's he's probably going to be the 6th man next year. You think Malik Beasley thinks in his head that he's anything less than a second option? That in a lot of ways, that's great. You've got a guy who has shown to be a 20-plus point per game scorer, 40% clip, but do they truly buy into winning as a group? And can Chris Finch manage the personalities to do that? I'm all in on Chris Finch as a thinker, and I'm to be determined on where he is as a personality synergizer, I guess.
Yeah. So we're on the D'Lo front specifically, because it was pretty easy coming back from injury, right? Hey, D'Lo, listen, we're going to bring you off the bench. You're going to play 20 minutes. Then we'll go to 25, 30. You'll come off the bench. But eventually you can sell that for a few weeks, right? Hey, we'll ease you back in. It'll be great. But eventually he's a starter. You're paying him to be a starting player. His ego says he's a starting player. And
Phil, his stats do.
For sure.
He's a player. D'Lo is a starting caliber player.
Yep. And so I guess if it gets to the point where D'Lo is very clearly 3rd in the pecking order instead of being 1st or 2nd, how much do you think he is going to be bought into his role evolving when it comes to what's best for winning?
See, I think what I've shifted on D'Lo, and this always happens. This is all Minnesota sports, right? We fancy ourselves we're well-rounded sports analysts. I watch the whole NFL, I watch the whole MLB, I watch the whole NBA, and you think you know guys before they get to their team. I remember Jeff Teague was the main one. I was oh yeah, I know Jeff Teague, Hawks, whatever. And then they come in and they're on the Timberwolves, and you're wait a minute, this player is actually A, B, and C when I thought they were X, Y, and Z. Yeah. And with D'Angelo Russell, I say that to be I label D'Lo as so much more of a scorer guy, that he was just isolation, getting to a shot. And what I feel I've learned from watching D'Angelo Russell and talking with him is he is a pass first guy. I think that is his ethos, is that's what he's looking. He's looking at playing off of other players. And if that playing off requires shooting, then it requires shooting. But I think he's cooler than we all think with being a distributor on this team. And so he's the one that I'm not too worried about him being the 3rd guy. And I think that's what everyone's going to say in the next year is oh, now it's Cat and Ant's team, and there's not going to be enough basketballs for D'Lo to go around. D'Lo might be a little prickly, so I'm not saying it's going to be totally clean, but I have no concern about D'Angelo Russell being oh, I'm not averaging 20 a game if the Wolves are playing 500 basketball. I don't think the D'Lo thing is going to go sour. It's going to be the question's going to be is if they go on a 3-12 stretch, and D'Lo's in that role and Malik's in a lower role. That's what I would start to be concerned about this team.
And Dane, I think you just hit on the most important thing that we don't know yet about Chris Finch, which is the management of the egos and people. Because he got thrown in here, and it was probably a breath of fresh air because the team was terrible at that time. But starting from day one now, this is going to be his team, his decisions across the board. And so it'll be that to me becomes the most important secondary thing to what your basketball philosophy is how well do you communicate and identify with and motivate, most importantly, probably to your point about defense, guys that aren't necessarily going to buy in unless they believe in what you're selling them.
And, Okay, so Ricky's been super honest all year, right? Like he talked about how it was bad when it was bad, and we know how that works. When players are honest, we listen to them when it's when they're saying other things too. And Britt asked Ricky about Chris Finch after the last game of the season, and Ricky, it was a really interesting answer where Ricky was like, Finch is going to be himself, and he's not going to back down in terms of personality to anybody, And the implications there were clear. Is Cat's been given a silver spoon for 6 years here. Like D'Lo has been a personality problem in previous stops with other coaching staffs there. It's like I'd take Ricky at his word there that Finch is good at this, and will not be kind of pushed around and will not cater to these guys in the way that maybe we've seen previous coaches either over cater to them or over ignore them. I mean, I think you guys know where I'm going with which coaches did that. I think Finch is just like a legit pro coach.
Yeah.
And he seemed like there's no you cannot normally in my job, you can kind of get a sense for when a guy or two on the roster isn't sold on the coach. I don't have that sense at all right now from anybody on this team. They're in on Finch. So I think we just roll with that for now, Judd, and readjust our expectations.
It's the Timberwolves, baby.
Yeah.
We're always readjusting.
Dave, we'll definitely we'll get you on again because we'd love to do at some point once A-Rod and Mark Lowry hold their official press conference, which I'm sure will happen. We'd love to just talk more about ownership. But real quick before we let you go, you have sort of coined the slogan "weirdest team ever" for this team, which I love. They are one of the weirdest teams in all of professional sports. What is on the Mount Rushmore of weirdest team ever things this year? What's the George Washington? What was the thing that made you said, "Oh, this really is the weirdest team ever"?
Try and pick a positive thing, because weirdest team ever is not only a negative thing. We know with the negative things that have played out this year, there's been some bad public imaging of the team that has happened, and that's weird. But the George Washington in a positive way is probably beating the Utah Jazz.
Yeah.
All 3 times that they played them this year. It's they're weird because they're unpredictable. They're weird because they are going to go in the direction that you least, expect them to go, and that is going to be maddening when it's bad, and it's going to be euphoric when it's good. It's what the hell? Alex Rodriguez owns this team now.
Yeah.
That's so weird. People are oh, they're not the weirdest team ever. I'm like, dude,
A-Rod owns
that's the George Washington. We got the whole Mount Rushmore of this stuff. I mean, what happened with Malik Beasley this year? There's a whole bunch of different things this year where the team is you don't know what you're gonna get. I feel every single time it's a Saturday. They think the Wolves got 2 days off. It's a Friday, Saturday, no games, out grilling, drinking some beers. Every time, me and Jace Frederick, who writes for the Pioneer Press, talk about this every time. Every time you get 36 hours of time off, John Krasinski comes out with some tweet, and Jimmy Butler's traded, or Alex Rodriguez owns the team, or Tibbs can't be found, or whatever it might be. It's I'm telling you, from sitting here doing this every day for years now, it's weird. This is a very weird team. I don't know what else to call it.
Amazing. All right, you go check out his podcast, the Dane Moore NBA podcast, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of great stuff as we lead up to the draft lottery and then hopefully the draft. I guess we'll see for the Timberwolves, but free agency and trade season, et cetera. So, all right, Dane, we'll talk again soon, man. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks, guys.
Dane.
All right,
Bye.
Dane Moore, our old buddy, he used to do some work covering the Wolves for Score North too over the last few years. Real quick, he mentioned Tom Thibodeau. So, and we'll play a clip later on the show so that you guys can tell me if my list was whack or not. But I was on with Keyshawn, J-Will, and Zubin. Zubin's been off, so Alan Hahn filled in for Zubin, and he's from ESPN New York. Mm-hmm. And at the very end of the discussion, so they let me go, but I could still hear them talking afterwards. And Alan, kind of under his breath, but still on the air, said, "Oh, and by the way, thanks for Tom Thibodeau." He's a big Knicks fan. He goes, "Thanks for Tom Thibodeau."
Yep.
And if I could have jumped back into the conversation, I would have said, "I'd give it one more year. I'd give it one more year before you get super comfortable and happy with Tom Thibodeau."
Yep.
So, by the way, Dane Moore's discussion with us was presented by our friends at PXG Minneapolis. PXG's been helping people improve their golf game, look better on the course, you name it. PXG will help you when it comes to your golf game. It's a golfer's paradise over in Southdale Center, and you can find out more at pxg.com/Minneapolis. The Gen 4 golf clubs, which are the best performing clubs PXG has ever made, and some great swag, some spring and summer apparel that just arrived. So PXG Minneapolis in Southdale Center, and find out more at pxg.com/Minneapolis. Before we get into other things here, anything that stood out there from our discussion with Dane? I think the fact that they have no cap space and maybe no draft pick is going to be problematic. So cross your fingers, but we'll see.
I think the thing that he said that stood out to me, because he's around the team so much and watches it every game, is his pessimism about how they're going to crack into the playoffs, which I think is going to stay with the play-in format, right? So it's 10 teams that get into a potential playoff tournament. Mm-hmm. Because I really do believe that the only success of building off what the Wolves did with Chris Finch late this year, when things did start to turn around, is to be in those top 10. Like, it's just, it's got, I know people will laugh and they're like, it's the Wolves. Of course, they're not going to make it. And I get all of that. But at some point in time, like, you either turn a page or, I don't know, you move. It's just, it's not that much to ask them to find a way to get into that top 10. And with the personnel that they have, Phil, it should be possible. Like, it's not like we're talking about 3 or 4 crappy players who are their quote unquote stars. Like, if this was all about, like, if we were talking right now and saying Malik Beasley's best player on this team, they'd be screwed. I get that. But, when it's Cat, D'Lo, and Ant, is it that preposterous to say that this should be a top 10 team? I'm not saying that they should contend for a Western Conference title. I'm not saying they should be top 5. But I don't think it's out of line to say that any rational sports fan group in any town would look at this roster and say, why can't you be team 9?
I think so. Dane's right about the West being loaded, and there's good young teams like the Pelicans, or they weren't in the 10, and like they were 11 this year, and like they'll jump in at some point. So it's very competitive. But I think Ant is headed maybe as soon as next year. He's headed for top 10 player in the league status at some point. Like, he's going to score 25, 30 points a game. He's learning how to be efficient. I think there's a learning curve defensively for some guys too. Like, at some point, he'll get better at defense. So if that happens, and all of a sudden now D'Lo's your 3rd best player, and that's probably more of the right role for him. I don't think he's the lead the franchise guy by any means. Now you got something. Something.
Yeah.
So it should be. Cross your fingers on the draft pick, because if you could add someone to this mix, that would be amazing. But the best thing to have happened is for this nucleus to have sort of figured it out down the stretch, regardless of what happens with this lottery pick.
And the potential thing that I really like that looks like it's beginning to happen is, with the personalities and people that this team now has as stars, they should slot in right. Which is, Ant is the guy. Like off the court too. Like, the way that Ant goes about life is perfect. He's young, he's charismatic, he's well spoken, he's a star player. So, and I mean, we've talked about this, Phil, going back 2 or 3 years. It allows Cat to slot in perfectly now, right? Because now this whole Cat's got to be the guy, Cat's got to stand up, Cat's got to talk. It's sort of off of him. So this allows him to, he might still be their best player on the floor, but it very much allows him to be, as far as face of the franchise goes, the second guy, which I think he's suited for ideally. And if D'Lo can accept his role, which, by the way, will still be pretty damn important, this, for the first time, if you think about it, chemistry-wise works, because Butler was supposed to work, but he didn't work because he was a raging jackass. Andrew was always going to be himself, which was a guy that basically would prefer, he might be smart, but he didn't want to talk. He was never going to take control. He never looked like he was truly having a good time. So I do think that we are now, as far as a grouping of human standpoint, to where the personalities can slot in almost perfectly.